Forget tanks and fighter jets. Long before the world imagined armored divisions and supersonic aircraft, France once looked to balloons as the future of warfare. The idea sounds almost comical today, something you might expect in a cartoon rather than on a battlefield. But for a time, the French military believed that drifting through the clouds in a giant balloon could give them the upper hand in combat. This wasn't just a passing curiosity, it was a grand gamble, a bold experiment in military innovation that promised to transform how wars were fought. And while it ended in failure, the story is as fascinating as it is absurd. Welcome to the strange world of Napoleonic balloon warfare. To understand how balloons entered the battlefield, you first have to step back to 1783, when the Montgolfier brothers of France launched their first hot air balloon into the sky. This was an age when the very concept of human flight was still little more than a dream. People marveled at the sight of these great spheres rising above the earth, carried aloft by nothing more than heated air. At fairs, festivals, and scientific demonstrations, balloons quickly became the wonder of Europe. They were beautiful, theatrical, and unlike anything people had ever seen. For many, they represented not just entertainment, but the dawning of a new scientific age. Among those captivated were members of the French military. They did not see balloons only as novelties. They saw them as potential weapons of war. The logic was simple. From the air, one could see enemy movements, spot reinforcements, and track supply lines. Armies that relied on scouts on horseback or vantage points on hills could only cover so much ground. A balloon, however, offered something entirely new: the ability to rise above the battlefield and observe everything at once. It was, in their minds, a chance to lift the fog of war. Napoleon Bonaparte, rising to prominence during the French Revolutionary Wars, was especially drawn to unconventional ideas that could give him an edge. He was no stranger to bold strategies. What others dismissed as eccentricity, Napoleon often saw as opportunity. Balloons, to him, looked like the future. And so, the French army took steps to transform this civilian marvel into a military tool. They formed what was known as the Aerostatic Corps, the world's first military balloon unit. Its mission was simple: to float above battlefields and provide intelligence that could shape the outcome of wars. At first, the idea worked better than expected. During the Battle of Fleurus in 1794, French balloonists successfully ascended into the skies. Observing the movements of Austrian and Dutch troops from their vantage point, they signaled French commanders, alerting them to enemy positions and reinforcing their strategies. Though historians still debate how much of a difference the balloon made in the battle, at the time it was hailed as a triumph. Here was proof, at least in French eyes, that the future of war had arrived. Soldiers on the ground began to look upward, seeing their comrades suspended in wicker baskets high above the battlefield. The image must have been surreal: a floating sphere, tethered by ropes, with officers peering down through spyglasses, sending reports back to commanders below. But while the promise was great, the practical challenges quickly revealed themselves. Balloons were fragile, dependent on weather, and cumbersome to deploy. To send one into the air required fuel, equipment, and a team of operators. The balloons had to be tethered to the ground for safety, which limited how far they could move. Strong winds could drag them off course or make ascension impossible altogether. On the battlefield, where speed and flexibility were often the keys to victory, balloons proved slow and unwieldy. They also made easy targets. While not as vulnerable as one might think, early artillery and musket fire struggled to reach them. Their presence was obvious. A balloon drifting overhead gave away French intentions as much as it revealed enemy movements. Even so, Napoleon remained intrigued. He carried the balloon unit with him on several campaigns, including his famous expedition to Egypt. Imagine the sight of a French balloon rising above the sands of North Africa, a strange and foreign machine in a land of ancient monuments and desert winds. The goal was the same: to give Napoleon's army the advantage of vision. Yet, as in Europe, the logistical difficulties mounted. Transporting balloons across seas and deserts proved nightmarish. Inflation of the balloon required hydrogen gas, a dangerous and labor-intensive process. Crews struggled to keep the equipment in working order. More often than not, the balloons were grounded either by weather or by sheer impracticality. Still, the French persisted because the dream was too powerful to abandon. To commanders of the day, the idea of looking down upon the enemy with godlike perspective was irresistible. They believed balloons could change the very nature of war. Yet, as time went on, it became increasingly clear that the promise outweighed the reality. Napoleon himself, pragmatic when it came to military efficiency, began to lose faith. The aerostatic corps, once a celebrated experiment, was eventually disbanded. Balloons drifted back into the realm of spectacle and entertainment. Their brief moment of military glory, little more than a curious footnote in history. But what makes the story compelling isn't just the failure, it's the ambition behind it. In an age when armies still fought with muskets, sabers, and cannons, the French dared to imagine a war fought from the skies. They looked up at floating orbs of silk and saw not toys, but tools of empire. This leap of imagination foreshadowed the future. Though balloons would not revolutionize warfare in Napoleon's time, they planted a seed that would eventually grow into airships, airplanes, and the vast aerial arsenals of later centuries. The dream of dominating the skies did not die with the aerostatic corps. It simply waited for technology to catch up. To picture this experiment in its proper context, imagine standing on a battlefield in the late 18th century. Soldiers line up in formation, muskets ready, cannons booming. The air is filled with smoke and confusion. Suddenly, overhead, a balloon rises, its ropes taut, its wicker basket carrying officers armed with telescopes. From above, they wave signals, sending coded messages down to commanders. The enemy, seeing this strange sphere above, can only wonder what secrets are being observed, what plans are being laid. For a brief moment, it must have seemed as if the future had truly arrived. And yet, like so many bold experiments in history, it was too far ahead of its time. The vision was extraordinary, but the tools were lacking. Balloons could not match the demands of the battlefield. They were more symbol than weapon, more dream than reality. Still, they left behind a legacy not of victory, but of imagination. They showed what happens when ambition outpaces practicality, when the desire to innovate collides with the limits of technology. This was the world of Napoleon's balloon warfare. Daring, imaginative, flawed, and unforgettable. It is a story that reminds us of how strange history can be, how easily brilliance can slip into farce, and how even failures can shape the path forward. And if you've enjoyed exploring this bizarre chapter of military history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. We've only just begun this 5-part journey into the tale of France's flying dreams. And trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. The promise of balloons in warfare didn't remain a mere vision for long. In 1794, revolutionary France officially founded something never before seen in the world, the aerostatic corps. It was not an experiment on the sidelines. It was a fully recognized branch of the French military. And its creation showed just how seriously the government and army believed in the future of aerial warfare. The men who made up this unit were known as the aerosteers, and they were trained to master a craft that no soldier had ever been asked to learn before: the strange, dangerous, and unpredictable art of ballooning. The aerostatic corps was born at a time of chaos and innovation. Revolutionary France was surrounded by enemies, fighting coalitions of European monarchies determined to crush the revolution. Every advantage mattered. Traditional methods of reconnaissance relied on cavalry scouts, runners, or high ground. All of these methods had limits. Balloons, however, offered something that seemed almost godlike in comparison: a view from the heavens. From above, one could see entire armies on the move, supply trains stretching into the distance, or weak points in enemy fortifications. For generals desperate for intelligence, this seemed like the ultimate tool. The aerosteers weren't ordinary soldiers. Their training mixed science, craftsmanship, and courage. They had to know how to build and maintain balloons made from delicate silk or cotton, coated in varnish to hold gas. They had to master the complex chemistry of producing hydrogen, a process that involved acids, metals, and dangerous fumes. And once the balloon was inflated, they had to deal with the terrifying reality of climbing into a basket and trusting thin ropes and canvas to hold them against gravity and the wind. For the late 18th century, this was cutting-edge technology, but it was also fragile, temperamental, and prone to sudden disaster. The very process of preparing a balloon for flight revealed just how limited the technology was. Inflating a hydrogen balloon wasn't as simple as pulling a cord or turning a valve. It required setting up chemical vats on the battlefield, sometimes for hours, as soldiers poured acid onto iron filings to release the precious gas. The process was messy, dangerous, and time-consuming. balloons were not something you could launch at a moment's notice. They required planning, resources, and cooperation from many soldiers, which meant they were slow and vulnerable before even leaving the ground. And once they did leave the ground, the aerosteers faced new challenges. Balloons in the 1790s had no engines or propellers. There was no steering wheel, no rudder, no means of control beyond letting gas out to descend or dropping ballast to rise. A balloon was at the mercy of the wind. If the breeze pushed them in the wrong direction, there was little they could do. A balloon meant for reconnaissance could easily drift into enemy lines or be rendered useless by a shift in weather. This unpredictability made every mission a gamble. Yet despite these risks, the aerosteers pressed on. Their balloons were tethered to the ground with long ropes, which allowed them to ascend while staying anchored to friendly territory. From their high vantage point, observers could sketch enemy positions, count formations, and send down notes. Communication was primitive but effective enough. Sometimes by dropping weighted messages, other times through a system of signals. It wasn't perfect, but it was more information than generals had ever been able to obtain before. But the balloonists also faced dangers unique to their new profession. Winds could snap ropes or cause sudden jolts that threatened to overturn baskets. The hydrogen inside the balloons was highly flammable, meaning that one spark, stray bullet, or cannon shot could turn the entire craft into a fiery death trap. Enemies quickly learned to target balloons, and their large, slow-moving shapes made them easy marks for artillery. The aerosteers' bravery wasn't just in taking to the sky, was in doing so while every soldier on the ground knew exactly where they were and tried to shoot them down. The materials themselves were another obstacle. Early balloons were fragile, their fabric vulnerable to tears, punctures, or even damage from rough handling. A small leak in the varnish could ground an entire operation. And transporting these massive balloons across muddy roads or battlefields was an ordeal of its own. Entire wagons were needed to carry the silk envelope, the basket, the ropes, and the vats for hydrogen production. The aerostatic corps was not a nimble, mobile force, it was a lumbering, specialized unit that needed protection and planning to function at all. The men who served as aerosteers often came from scientific or artisan backgrounds rather than traditional military life. They were part soldier, part engineer, part daredevil. Their work demanded precision, but also a willingness to face ridicule. Many traditional officers scoffed at the idea of balloons. To them, these floating contraptions seemed impractical, even laughable, compared to the reliability of cavalry scouts or seasoned infantry. The aerosteers constantly had to prove that their strange machines were worth the effort. Even when they succeeded in rising into the sky, their presence on the battlefield created mixed reactions. For soldiers on the ground, seeing a balloon drifting above could be inspiring, a symbol of modern science aiding the nation. But for enemies, it was a target, and one they were eager to destroy. The aerosteers were exposed in ways that no other soldiers were. They could observe the battlefield, but they could also be observed, and their very existence announced France's strange new experiment to the world. The limitations were obvious. The balloons could not fly in bad weather, which meant rain, strong winds, or storms often grounded them. Their lack of maneuverability restricted their use to very specific conditions. They required a protected position from which to launch, meaning they could rarely be deployed in the middle of fast-moving battles. And when the enemy adapted, targeting their balloons with concentrated fire, the aerosteers had little defense other than staying aloft and hoping their tethers and materials held out. Still, the mere creation of the aerostatic corps was groundbreaking. It showed how revolutionary France was willing to gamble on untested ideas in search of any advantage. The aerosteers stood at the intersection of science and war, proving that military innovation often comes from bold leaps, even if those leaps don't always land as intended. Their struggles with wind, fire, fragile silk, and skeptical commanders revealed both the promise and the peril of being the first to attempt aerial reconnaissance. At this stage in history, the aerosteers were a bold experiment rather than a reliable asset. They had shown glimpses of potential, but every mission reminded the French army of the practical difficulties of balloon warfare. Each ascent into the skies carried with it both hope and risk, and the men who rode those winds knew that their place in military history was far from secure. The aerosteers had trained, experimented, and prepared their strange craft for war. But theory and practice are two very different things. The true test of balloon warfare came not in a laboratory or a training field, but on the muddy, bloody fields of Europe, where revolutionary France fought for survival. And it was here that the limits of balloon technology were revealed for all to see. The Battle of Fleurus in June of 1794 is often remembered as the great showcase of the French balloon corps. It was the first time in history that a military balloon played an active role in a major engagement. The balloon, l'Entrepenant, rose into the air, tethered to the ground, and carried French observers high above the battlefield. From their vantage point, they had a panoramic view of the Austrian and Dutch forces. The aerosteers sketched enemy troop movements and passed down signals reporting on concentrations of cavalry, the shifting lines of infantry, and the movement of artillery. On paper, this should have been a game changer. For the first time, a commanding general could receive intelligence from the sky. The aerosteers could spot enemy formations long before they came into contact with French troops. It was a vision straight out of science fiction for the 18th century, a nation of revolutionaries wielding the power of the heavens. But in practice, things were far less impressive. The balloon could only see a portion of the battlefield at a time, and the information that reached the generals was slow and incomplete. Communication between the balloon and the ground relied on notes and signals, a clumsy system at best. By the time a message describing enemy movement reached the command tent, conditions had already changed. A mass of infantry seen advancing 10 minutes ago could already have shifted or retreated. There was also the problem of interpretation. An observer from high above might see a large group of soldiers, but what did it mean? Were they reinforcements, a feint, or simply a supply train? The generals on the ground still had to make their own judgments, and the balloon's reports often created as much confusion as clarity. At Fleurus, the balloon l'Entrepenant was in the air for hours, drifting above the French lines. Its presence was noted by everyone, friend and foe alike. Soldiers on both sides watched the floating giant as it bobbed in the sky. For French troops, it was a strange reassurance, a sign that science was on their side. For Austrian and Dutch soldiers, it was an ominous sight, an eye in the sky that seemed to watch their every move. But despite this psychological impact, the balloon didn't deliver the decisive advantage its creators had promised. Yes, the aerosteers spotted enemy formations and reported them. Yes, the French generals received information that might otherwise have been hidden. But the battle was still fought in the old ways by infantry charges, artillery bombardments, and cavalry maneuvers. The intelligence from the balloon was useful, but it did not change the outcome in any dramatic way. The French won Fleurus, but it was their numbers, tactics, and the determination of their soldiers that carried the day, not the balloon swaying high above. The truth was becoming clear. Balloons were impressive symbols of innovation, but their practical impact was limited. Every aspect of their use on the battlefield was a logistical nightmare. Transporting a balloon required wagons full of equipment, the silk envelope, the wicker basket, the coils of rope, and, most cumbersome of all, the chemical vats needed to produce hydrogen. Inflating a balloon was a laborious process that could take hours. In the middle of a war zone, this was a dangerous delay. An army on the move could not afford to stop and wait for a balloon to fill. Even once in the air, the balloons were highly vulnerable. At Fleurus, the Austrians tried to target l'Entrepenant with artillery fire. They didn't succeed in bringing it down, but the message was clear. These giant floating targets could be destroyed if the enemy concentrated their efforts. In later battles, balloons were sometimes forced to remain lower in the air or to stay close to cover to avoid becoming easy prey. A single cannonball or musket volley could rip through the silk envelope and send the aerosteers crashing down. Where there was another enemy, balloons could not be launched in high winds, heavy rain, or storms. On a clear day, they were useful, but wars are not fought only on clear days. Entire campaigns could pass with the aerosteers grounded by weather. Even when the skies were calm, the wind might carry smoke or haze from the battlefield, limiting visibility. The grand promise of having a clear bird. Side view of the enemy often turned into hours of staring through murky air with little to show for it. There was also the human factor. Generals, many of them veterans of decades of traditional campaigning, often distrusted or dismissed the balloon reports. Some saw them as novelties, more spectacle than substance. Others resented the aerosteers themselves, who seemed more like scientists in uniforms than real soldiers. The skepticism within the French command undermined the very purpose of the corps. If a general did not trust the intelligence provided by the balloon, then the entire risky operation of inflating and launching it was wasted effort. Over time, the problems became impossible to ignore. Each use of the balloon highlighted its shortcomings to slow, to fragile, to exposed, to dependent on conditions beyond human control. What had begun as a revolutionary idea was starting to look more and more like a costly distraction. The aerosteers themselves knew it. They could see how much work was required to set up their craft, how dangerous it was to ascend in full view of the enemy, and how little their reports seemed to matter once the battle was in motion. At Fleurus, the balloon may have been hailed as a success, but behind the praise, there was a quieter recognition that this was not the future of warfare. It was an impressive experiment, but it was also impractical. France's armies needed speed, flexibility, and reliability, and the aerostatic corps offered none of these. Still, the story of these balloonists continues to fascinate because it captures something deeply human: the willingness to take bold risks in pursuit of new ideas. The aerosteers represented both the brilliance and the folly of innovation in war. They showed that even in the bloodiest of times, imagination could soar, even if the results fell far short of the dream. And speaking of bold experiments, if you're enjoying this dive into history's strangest military ideas, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Your support keeps these bizarre and fascinating stories alive, and there are plenty more ahead. For the aerosteers, however, the skies were already beginning to close. Their moment of triumph at Fleurus was as good as it would get, and from there, reality began to set in. The balloon corps had shown what it could do, and just as quickly, it revealed what it could not. The aerosteers entered history as dreamers and pioneers, but they did not leave it as victors. What had once been hailed as a revolution in warfare soon proved to be a fragile experiment, one that could not withstand the demands of real battlefields. By the closing years of the 18th century, the dream of balloon armies had lost its lift. The reasons for this failure were many, but at their heart was a simple truth: war had moved too fast, and balloons could not keep up. From the very start, the balloon corps struggled with its pace. A balloon was not like a cavalry unit or a battery of artillery that could be moved quickly into position. The aerosteers had to carry not only the balloon, but the entire infrastructure to inflate it. The silk envelope was delicate, the wicker gondola fragile, and the vast coils of rope unwieldy. Most difficult of all was the gas. In the 1790s, hydrogen was produced on-site using cumbersome chemical vats filled with sulfuric acid and iron filings. This process could take hours, sometimes longer, and it left the aerosteers vulnerable. While infantry and cavalry could march overnight to be in place by dawn, the balloon crews often needed a full day just to get their craft into the sky. In a war of maneuver, that delay was deadly. Generals soon noticed the mismatch. The French armies of the Revolution were famed for their mobility, for their ability to move vast numbers of men quickly across Europe and surprise their enemies with speed. Balloons, by contrast, tied the army down. At Fleurus, the novelty of the aerosteers was tolerated, even celebrated, because it was new. But in the campaigns that followed, the balloon became a burden. When troops marched, the balloon slowed them. When troops fought, the balloon revealed little that scouts on horseback or officers with spyglasses could not already discover. The fragility of the balloons was another constant problem. They depended on calm weather, something no general could command. A sudden gust of wind might pull a balloon off its tether, dragging men and equipment across the ground. Heavy rain could soak the fabric, weighing it down and making flight impossible. A thunderstorm could rip the fragile silk to shreds. Entire campaigns passed with the balloon grounded by weather, leaving the aerosteers watching from below as their comrades marched into battle. Even when they did get into the air, the view was not always the advantage it was imagined to be. Smoke from cannon fire, haze from campfires, or even morning fog could obscure the enemy. Observers might be able to see troops moving in the distance, but they could not always tell their numbers or their intent. And when they could see, transmitting that information down to the generals was still a clumsy process. Handwritten notes sent by ropes or shouted signals were often delayed or misunderstood. By the time a report reached the commander, the battle had already shifted. Worse still, balloons were targets. An enemy did not need to guess where the aerosteers were operating. Their balloon was visible for miles, a large, unmoving silhouette against the sky. At Fleurus, the Austrians had tried to shoot L'Entreprenant out of the sky, and though they failed, the possibility lingered in every campaign. A balloon tethered to the ground was a stationary mark for enemy gunners, and one well-aimed shot could bring disaster. Even if the balloon survived, its presence revealed the position of the French army's command. What was meant to be an advantage in reconnaissance risked becoming a liability. Meanwhile, other methods of gathering intelligence were improving: cavalry patrols, light infantry scouts, and even captured enemy messengers provided more reliable, immediate information than the balloonists. Cartography was advancing. Detailed maps gave generals a clearer picture of the terrain than any aerosteer sketch from the sky. With a good map, a spyglass, and a fast horse, a skilled officer could often do more than a balloon ever could. The aerostatic corps also suffered from a lack of faith within its own ranks. Many generals saw the balloons as curiosities, not tools of war. They tolerated the aerosteers when convenient, but rarely relied on them. Two men hardened by years of traditional campaigning. The idea of depending on floating silk bags filled with volatile gas seemed absurd, and when reports from the balloons turned out to be vague, incomplete, or outdated, their skepticism deepened. Without the trust of commanders, the aerosteers were little more than a sideshow. By the late 1790s, the enthusiasm that had created the aerostatic corps was gone. What had once been hailed as a glimpse into the future was now seen as an expensive distraction. Maintaining the balloons, transporting their equipment, and training their crews drained resources without delivering results. Napoleon Bonaparte, who valued speed, discipline, and decisive action above all else, had little patience for balloons. When he led his armies in Italy and later in Egypt, the aerosteers were nowhere to be seen. The balloon corps was left behind, irrelevant to his vision of modern warfare. In 1799, the experiment officially ended. The French government disbanded the aerostatic corps, quietly folding it into history. There was no grand ceremony, no defiant last stand of the balloonists. They simply faded away, their equipment stored or discarded, their names remembered only in scattered reports. For all the hope and ambition that had launched them, the aerosteers had lasted just 5 years. The silence of their disappearance is striking. One might expect outrage or debate, but in truth, few mourned the loss. Soldiers and generals were too busy fighting wars that demanded real results. The balloon corps had never lived up to its promise, and its end was met not with grief, but with indifference. For the men who had devoted themselves to the skies, it must have been a bitter realization. They had believed they were part of something revolutionary, a new dimension of war. Instead, they became a footnote. Yet even in their failure, the aerosteers left an impression. Their brief existence showed how far human imagination was willing to stretch, even in times of bloodshed. They were dreamers in uniform, men who believed that the sky could be conquered not for adventure, but for the grim purpose of war. Their story reminds us that not every bold idea succeeds, and that sometimes the very act of trying is what keeps such ideas alive in memory. The deflation of this dream was inevitable. Balloons were simply too fragile, too slow, and too unreliable for the brutal pace of Napoleonic warfare. But for a few short years, they floated above the battlefield, a strange symbol of human ambition. And even as they drifted into obscurity, they carried with them the lesson that innovation, no matter how daring, must bow to the realities of war. The aerosteers may have faded into history as a failed experiment, but their story is not one of complete futility. In fact, their rise and fall tell us something profound about the way human beings approach innovation, especially in times of war. The balloon army of France may not have conquered the skies, but it dared to try at a time when most people still considered the heavens untouchable. That daring, even in failure, left behind a legacy that would echo into the centuries that followed. When we look back at the short life of the aerostatic corps, the first lesson is about vision. The very act of imagining that balloons could change the battlefield was remarkable. France was already a nation in turmoil during the 1790s, fighting wars on multiple fronts while undergoing a political and social revolution at home. In such a context, the easy path would have been to stick with tradition: horses, cannons, muskets, and infantry formations. Yet, the leaders of the revolution allowed space for something different, something unproven, something radical. That willingness to take risks is at the heart of all technological progress. The aerosteers showed that boldness, even when it failed, was a kind of courage. But vision alone was never enough. The second lesson is about adaptability. Warfare is ruthless in exposing weaknesses, and the Balloon Corps was no exception. They faced the problem of mobility, the challenge of weather, and the vulnerability of being highly visible targets. These were not minor inconveniences, they were fundamental flaws. Instead of adapting the technology further or finding ways to complement balloons with other methods, the French quickly abandoned the idea. The aerosteers remind us that innovation does not stop at invention. It requires constant refinement, learning from mistakes, and pushing through failures until a workable solution is found. The tragedy of the aerosteers is that they appeared too soon, in an era without engines, radios, or reliable weather forecasting. Their failure was not entirely their fault. It was a problem of timing. Yet, their failure also foreshadowed the future. When the Wright brothers took to the skies more than a century later, they achieved what the aerosteers could not: controlled, powered flight. By then, the lessons of balloons had been absorbed. Armies around the world had experimented with tethered observation balloons throughout the 19th century. And by the time of the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces deployed them for reconnaissance. In World War I, observation balloons once again returned to the battlefield, this time equipped with telegraphs and cameras to provide real-time intelligence. By then, balloons were no longer curiosities. They had become part of the larger system of air power. In that sense, the aerosteers had not truly failed. They had simply been the first step in a much longer journey. This leads us to the third lesson: the importance of persistence. The Aerostatic Corps was disbanded in 1799, and with it, the dream of aerial warfare seemed to collapse. But ideas rarely die so isolate. They linger, waiting for the right conditions to reappear. The Montgolfier brothers had shown that humans could rise into the air. The aerosteers had shown that those who rose could look down on the battlefield and see more than those who remained on the ground. Once demonstrated, those ideas could not be forgotten. Even if the French abandoned their balloon corps, the seed of the concept had been planted. And it would germinate decades later, when technology finally caught up. Another lesson is about the thin line between brilliance and folly. To many of their contemporaries, the aerosteers must have seemed ridiculous. Men in wicker baskets floating above the battlefield, surrounded by fragile silk envelopes full of volatile hydrogen. The enemy laughed. Their own generals doubted them, and their soldiers mocked them as dreamers. And yet, history would vindicate the idea of using the sky in war. The laughter of the 1790s would turn to awe in the 20th century, when planes and zeppelins darkened the skies over Europe. The aerosteers show us how the world often dismisses ideas before their time. What looks foolish today may prove visionary tomorrow. There is also a darker lesson embedded in their story: the way human ingenuity is so often bound to violence. The same technology that had amazed crowds at public demonstrations of Montgolfier balloons was quickly absorbed into the machinery of war. The dream of flying, which could have been about exploration or wonder, was instead directed toward killing and control. The aerosteers remind us that military innovation is often the first arena where radical new ideas are tested. It was true with balloons, and it was true with airplanes, rockets, and satellites. The desire to conquer the battlefield often accelerates technology, but it also warps it into tools of destruction. At the same time, the story of the aerosteers serves as a reminder that failure in war does not always mean failure in history. The French Balloon Corps collapsed, but their effort laid a foundation. It provided a proof of concept, however flawed, that future generations could build upon. When you trace the line of air power from observation balloons to the fighter jets and drones of today, the faint outline of the aerosteers is still visible at the beginning of that story. They may not have succeeded in their own time, but they shaped the imagination of what was possible. It is striking to how much the aerosteers embody the paradox of innovation, that progress often begins with embarrassment. The images of French soldiers struggling to inflate a balloon in the mud, desperately protecting fragile silk from rain, or watching as their craft was dragged by sudden winds across a field. These are almost comic, and yet, within that comedy lies the courage to attempt something no one had tried before. Every breakthrough is preceded by such scenes of awkward failure. The aerosteers remind us that history's great leaps often begin with stumbles. In the end, the story of France's balloon army is not only about military failure, it is about imagination, courage, and the strange ways in which history unfolds. The aerosteers were pioneers of the air, even if their craft was impractical. They dreamed of giving generals a bird's-eye view long before technology could make it reliable. Their time in history was brief, but their impact stretched further than they could ever have known. And perhaps that is the final lesson, that ideas have a life beyond those who first attempt them. The aerosteers did not live to see airplanes, zeppelins, or satellites. They did not know that their fragile hydrogen balloons were the first in a long chain leading to supersonic jets and spaceflight. They believed in their vision. They tested it in war, and though they failed, the idea itself endured. That endurance is as much their legacy as the failures that surrounded them. So when we look back at the balloon corps of revolutionary France, we see more than just a failed experiment. We see the first sparks of a fire that would blaze centuries later. We see the strange mixture of absurdity and brilliance that so often marks the path of human progress. And we are reminded that even the most foolish-sounding attempts can shape the world in ways their creators never imagined. The balloon army may have deflated, but its story still rises, lighter than air, into the strange and fascinating corners of history. And if you've enjoyed this dive into one of history's strangest military experiments, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more stories where the past is always stranger than fiction.